In the summer of a group of 6 teenagers, each with their own reasons for venturing out into the Oregon wilderness, piled into a van and drove to a remote cabin at the edge of Blue Hollow, a dense forest with a reputation for strange occurrences and an even stranger history. The group Casey, Monica, Dylan, Jesse, Finn, and Liam had heard the legends of Blue Hollow, where settlers had mysteriously vanished, animals behaved oddly, and trees seemed to move on their own. But for most of them, the stories were just that. Stories. After all, what could be so bad about an old cabin and a few nights away from the city? As they pulled up to the clearing, the cabin looked smaller and darker than they'd expected, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees. The air was damp and cool, a dense mist hanging just above the ground like a hovering fog that drifted around their feet. The trees seemed to stretch on endlessly, their branches tangled and interwoven, casting strange shadows that twisted with every movement of the mist. "All right, team," Casey said, turning off the van. "This is it, our home for the weekend." No one said much as they got out and unloaded their gear. The air had a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional chirping of distant birds or the sound of something small scurrying through the underbrush. Dylan, always the clown, was the first to break the tension with a mock shiver. "Anyone else getting cursed forest vibes?" He laughed, though it was nervous, echoing faintly through the trees. "Oh, stop it, Dylan," Monica chided, though she, too, seemed tense. "It's just a normal forest." But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You." First night. Inside the cabin, they found old, worn-out furniture, a stone fireplace filled with ash, and walls covered in a faded wallpaper that looked as though it had once been bright and cheerful. Now it was peeling, revealing patches of wood beneath. A heavy, musty scent permeated the air, as though the walls themselves were steeped in years of dust and secrets. But with a fire crackling and flashlights set up for extra light, the cabin took on a cozier, if still eerie, atmosphere. They gathered around the fireplace, where Liam dug into his backpack and pulled out an old book, grinning. "All right, listen up. The Legends of Blue Hollow. I got this from the library back home," he said, waving it. "It's got all the creepy stories about this place." Jessie laughed, though it was nervous. "Perfect bedtime reading. What's the scariest one?" Liam flipped through the pages, settling on a chapter titled The Vanished Ones. Clearing his throat, he began to read aloud. In the Lates, a small community settled on the outskirts of Blue Hollow. People came here looking for a new life, driven by the promise of land and freedom. But things soon turned strange. Crops failed inexplicably, livestock disappeared without a trace, and neighbors began to speak of strange sounds in the forest at night, whispers and distant laughter, echoing through the trees. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across Liam's face as he read, his voice dropping to a whoosh. Within a year, the settlers began to vanish. One by one, families would go to bed, only for their houses to be found empty the next morning with no sign of where they had gone. The last person to leave was an old man, a recluse named Thomas Hale, who claimed that the forest was alive, that it didn't just surround the village, but that it was the village in a way. Dylan snorted, trying to shake off the chill that ran down his spine. "So the trees eat people. Is that the big twist?" "Not exactly," Liam said, eyes fixed on the page. "They say that Thomas Hale went insane in his final days, but before he disappeared, he wrote a warning in his diary, something that no one has ever been able to fully decipher. He wrote, 'The hollow will take what it is owed, blood for roots, flesh for branches. The forest grows as we fall.'" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Each of them felt the weight of the words, as if the forest itself were listening. Jessie pulled her knees to her chest, glancing out the window. "All right, enough of that," she said, her voice shakier than she wanted. "It's just a story. Let's just get some sleep." They reluctantly agreed, though the words from the story lingered in their minds. The cabin fell silent, though none of them slept soundly, each one awakening in the middle of the night to strange creaks, distant footsteps, or the sense of a shadow passing over them. The second day. The next morning, they decided to explore the forest, hoping a bit of fresh air would shake the lingering tension from the previous night. Casey, who had a natural sense of direction, led them down a narrow path that wound through the trees, the mist swirling around their ankles. They tried to keep it light-hearted, laughing and joking, but the deeper they went, the quieter they became, as though the forest itself swallowed their voices. After about an hour, they stumbled upon an abandoned clearing, scattered with small piles of rocks arranged in strange formations. Each stone was etched with a crude symbol, some like spirals, others like broken circles. Finn bent down, brushing his hand over one of the stones. These look familiar," he murmured. "They're similar to the carvings I saw in a book about old pagan rituals. This one," he pointed to a symbol that looked like a jagged star. "It's meant to summon spirits." Dylan laughed, though his voice wavered. "Summoning spirits? So, what? There's gonna be some kind of ghost pop out and ask for a letter." But Casey looked uneasy. "Maybe we should head back," he suggested, glancing around. "There's something off about this place." Just as they turned to leave, they heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried by the wind, though they couldn't make out any words. It sent a chill down their spines, and they hurried back to the cabin, each of them feeling a strange, almost gravitational pull as they left the clearing, as if something had tried to hold them back. Strange occurrences. That night, they sat around the fire again, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled over them. Monica finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did anyone else hear something in the clearing?" They all nodded, though no one wanted to admit how unsettling it had been. "Maybe we should leave," Jessie said, her voice trembling. "Just cut the trip short. This place isn't right." But Casey, who had organized the trip, shook his head. "Look, it's just a spooky forest. We'll be fine." They tried to convince themselves he was right, but when night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin turned oppressive. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the faint light, and strange sounds echoed outside. Scratches at the windows, like fingernails dragging across the glass, and soft footsteps circling the cabin. Dylan, who was usually the last to take things seriously, clutched his sleeping bag, his eyes darting around the room. "Do you think it's someone messing with us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. But they all knew, deep down, that no one from the outside was near them. Whatever was there, it was part of the forest. The disappearance. The next morning, Jessie was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, her backpack still resting by her bunk. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area, calling her name, but there was no answer. Panic set in as they realized that, in such a vast forest, finding her would be next to impossible. After hours of searching, they returned to the cabin, exhausted and terrified. As night fell, they huddled together, waiting in silence, straining to hear any sign of Jessie. Around midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they were closer, just outside the cabin walls, and they were clearer, a soft, lilting voice that called each of their names, one by one. Dylan covered his ears, muttering to himself, but the voice seemed to slip into their minds, even without hearing it. Then came the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the cabin. The door creaked, as though someone had pressed against it, and a shadow passed by the window, a dark, distorted shape that didn't quite seem human. Finn grabbed Casey's arm, his face pale. "Is that Jessie?" he whispered. But none of them dared to answer, too frightened to speak. The spiral path. The following morning, they decided they had to leave. They packed quickly, leaving behind anything they couldn't carry, and started down the trail. But no matter which path they chose, the trail seemed to twist back on itself, leading them in circles. By midday, they found themselves back at the cabin, even though they had walked in a straight line. Monica sat down, her face in her hands. "We're trapped, aren't we? The forest. It's keeping us here." Liam tried to calm her, but even he looked defeated. "There has to be a way out," he said, though his voice shook. "Maybe if we go back to that clearing, where the stones were, there could be something there." Reluctantly, they agreed, returning to the clearing with the strange stone formations. The air there was thicker, almost suffocating, and as they stepped into the clearing, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The symbols on the stones seemed darker, as though they'd been freshly carved, and a faint mist rose from the ground, twisting into spirals that mirrored the markings. Suddenly, Casey stumbled, clutching his head. I hear them, he whispered, his face contorted with fear. Voices. They're calling to me. They want me to stay. The others pulled him back, but Casey's eyes had changed, darkened, as though something else looked out from behind them. He tried to resist, but his body seemed to move on its own, pulling him toward the stones. The others tried to restrain him, but he fought them off with a strength they didn't know he had. I have to stay, he repeated, his voice hollow. I belong here. With a final, desperate struggle, they pulled him from the clearing, though he continued to mutter and stare back at the stones, his eyes filled with longing. The final night. That night, as they sat in the cabin, each of them knew that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air until it was impossible to tell if they were real or just in their minds. The shadows twisted and stretched, taking on strange forms, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. Just before dawn, the door to the cabin creaked open, though none of them had touched it. Outside, they saw Jessie, standing at the edge of the trees, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at them with an expression that was both blank and filled with sorrow. Jessie, Monica whispered, stepping forward. But as she did, Jessie's face contorted, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her form flickering like a dying light. The forest seemed to pulse, the trees swaying as though alive, and the ground beneath them trembled. Then, in an instant, Jessie was gone, and the cabin door slammed shut. The last morning. When morning came, the remaining group found themselves alone, the forest silent and still. They gathered their things and tried the trail again, this time finding their way back to the main road without incident. But as they looked back, they saw the mist thickening, rising from the ground to swallow the cabin and the forest in a shroud of fog. They never spoke of Blue Hollow again, each haunted by memories they couldn't fully explain, and each of them felt, deep down, that a part of them had been left behind, bound forever to the shadows of that cursed forest. As they returned to their lives, the survivors of Blue Hollow carried with them a quiet, unshakable dread. None of them spoke of the forest again, but each felt a subtle weight pressing on them, a sense that they were still being watched. The world beyond Blue Hollow seemed hollowed out, like a faded version of reality, a place they no longer fully belonged to. The lingering darkness. A few weeks after they'd returned, Monica started having dreams. In them, she was back in the forest, the mist curling around her ankles as she walked down a twisting path. Shadows flitted in the trees, and she felt a tugging sensation, as if something deep in the hollow was calling her back. Sometimes, she would see Jessie standing in the distance, eyes hollow, hand raised as if beckoning her closer. She would wake each time drenched in sweat, her pulse pounding. She confided in Casey, the only one who seemed willing to talk about the experience. He, too, had been having strange visions, flashbacks to the stones in the clearing, symbols twisting in his mind like roots burrowing deeper with every memory. I think, maybe it marked us, he whispered one night on the phone, his voice hoarse, like a part of us never left. Casey wasn't alone. Finn had been feeling the same pull, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind that seemed to grow louder each day. He had started seeing things in the corners of his vision. Shadows that lingered, dark shapes flickering through the trees near his house. At night, he would sometimes hear a soft tapping at his window, like fingers brushing against the glass. One night, he couldn't stand it anymore. Driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, he went to the woods behind his house and carved a spiral into a tree, tracing the same shapes he'd seen on the stones in Blue Hollow. As he finished the last curve, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if the mark had somehow sated the presence that had been haunting him. But as he walked back to his house, he felt eyes watching him from the dark, and a faint, familiar whisper echoed in his ears. The forest grows as we fall. The reunion. A year passed. The events of Blue Hollow became buried in the routines of daily life, but for each of them, The memories remained, flickering just beneath the surface. Then, one day Monica received a letter. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Jessie's. The letter was short, almost cryptic. "Meet me at the old cabin. I need to show you something." The others received similar letters, each one bearing Jessie's handwriting, each inviting them back to Blue Hollow. The invitation was absurd, terrifying even. Jessie had vanished. They'd all seen her flicker and fade into the forest's mist. But the letters compelled them, the same strange pull that had led them into the hollow in the first place. On a cold, foggy morning, they found themselves once more at the edge of the forest. The cabin was just as they remembered it, dark, silent, seemingly waiting for them. As they stepped into the clearing, an unnatural stillness settled over the air. It was as if the forest recognized them, as if it had been waiting. Casey glanced at the others, his face pale. Are we really doing this?" But before anyone could respond, they heard a voicey, soft, familiar laugh that floated through the trees. Jessie's voice. "Welcome back." They turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, looking just as she had that last night in the forest. Her face was expressionless, her eyes distant, yet she seemed all too real. "Jessie," Monica whispered, stepping forward, her hand trembling. Jessie tilted her head, a strange smile playing at her lips. "It's been waiting," she said, her voice soft and calm. "The hollow wants what it's owed." The ground trembled slightly, and shadows began to gather, coiling around her like smoke. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning forward, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that reached out like skeletal hands. "What do you mean?" Finn stammered, his heart pounding. Jessie's expression turned sad. "We left the forest, but we never really escaped. We're bound to it now. You've felt it too, haven't you? The whispers, the dreams, we're still part of the hollow." Monica felt the weight of Jessie's words settle over her, a creeping sense of inevitability. "Why did you bring us back here?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jessie's gaze turned distant, her face flickering like a shadow caught in shifting light. "It needs something. We never gave it what it wanted, but it will take it now." The mist thickened, swirling around them, and the ground began to shake. Suddenly Monica felt a hand on her shoulder, Jessie's hand, cold and solid, yet somehow unreal. "The hollow grows as we fall," Jessie whispered. "It's hungry, and it's never satisfied." The shadows around them coalesced, twisting into vague, human-like shapes that stood silently, watching. They recognized the forms, faces they'd only seen in nightmares, people from the legends, settlers, hunters, other campers who'd vanished over the years, all bound to the forest, all claimed by Blue Hollow. The shadows began to close in, and Jessie stepped back, her face hollow once more. "There's no escape," she murmured, "only surrender." The shadows surged forward, enveloping them, pulling them down into the mist, and as they fell, the last thing they saw was Jessie's face, flickering in the fog, a faint, sad smile lingering as they disappeared into the hollow. Aftermath. Weeks passed before a search party was dispatched to Blue Hollow. The families of the missing teens had insisted, though most people doubted anything would be found. After all, Blue Hollow had a way of swallowing secrets. When the searchers finally arrived, they found the cabin empty, untouched. The forest was silent, as though it had never seen a soul. But near the cabin, in a small clearing scattered with strange stones, they found something odd. 5 spirals carved into the trees, freshly etched into the bark. The symbols twisted into the wood-like roots, pulsing faintly, as if alive. And somewhere deep within the hollow, a whisper echoed through the trees, soft and almost welcoming, as though calling for the next visitors to wander in. Blue Hollow had taken what it was owed, but the forest would always hunger, and it would wait patiently, until the next soul ventured too deep into its shadowed embrace.